you for making it here somewhat early, and thank you very much to Robert and all of those who have helped him to organize this amazing event. I'm very excited to be able to hear all of the work so far and to be able to present my work here. So thank you for this opportunity. The work I'm going to present now, let's see. So what I'm going to present now comes from a book that just came out in November, The Afterlife of Averroes. And the book is organized into, in three parts. The first of which focuses on representations and uses of Averroes, or and so I'm going to present part of that part, if that makes sense. And if you're curious about where what are the other works that I look at, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. So, what happens when a philosopher from Andalusi travels across time and space to modern-day Morocco and to Borges' Buenos Aires? To find out, in this talk, we'll map the travels of Ibn Rushd, known to European languages as Averroes. Ibn Rushd has a central role in both the cultural history of Al-Andalus in 20th and 21st century discourses about Islam and East-West relations. The 12th century Ottoman philosopher, physician, judge, and philosopher is arguably the Muslim thinker who is equally well known in Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa region. So this is from a 14th century Italian painting, one of various portraits of Ibn Rushd. Famous for having written a commentary on Aristotle that reintroduced the latter's ideas in Europe, Ibn Rushd is also the site of discussions about the plausibility of cultural translation and the material used in various negotiations of identity. This mapping of Ibn Rushd's travels consists of a comparative analysis of renowned Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges' 1947 short story La Busca de Averroes, translated as Averroes' Search, and two 21st century short stories from the Arab world that invoke and rewrite the Borges story. This analysis seeks to elucidate the relationship between Al-Andalus, attitudes towards cultural translatability, and conceptions of intercultural harmony. Representations of Ibn Rushd vary greatly in terms of whether they emphasize limitations versus potential for meaningful contact between the realms of East versus West, and religious versus secular. My comparative analysis demonstrates how questions of translatability are intertwined with Orientalism and narrative constructions of self. Ultimately, I argue that narrative constructions of identity and truth are the foundation for the conceptions of translatability/untranslatability that hamper or encourage intercultural communication. I'll start, though, by addressing the place of Ibn Rushd in historical and contemporary discourses. Ibn Rushd was born in Córdoba to a family of legal scholars. He also became a faqih, or expert in Islamic law. But his scholarly work covered a range of topics from philosophy and theology to music theory to medicine and astronomy. Ibn Rushd's reception has been greatly varied. In the medieval period, his work influenced thinkers from Jewish scholar and fellow Cordovan Maimonides to Christian theologian and scholastic philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas. In Europe, Ibn Rushd became most known for his commentaries on the works of Aristotle, which he read in Arabic translations produced by others. Although in the 1200s Aristotelian and Averroes teachings were banned as heretical at the University of Paris, Latin translations of Ibn Rushd's commentaries reintroduced the Greek thinker to Europe and led to the creation of scholasticism, in which Christian doctrines were analyzed for reason. Thus, Ibn Rushd is often credited with having introduced secularism into Western Europe and paving the way for European Renaissance. And to this day, the Andalusi thinker is held up as a symbol of cross-cultural intellectual inquiry. primarily in Europe, however. So that's what his legacy has been known as in Europe. But in Arab and Muslim cultural spheres, although Ibn Rushd still has many detractors and positive allusions to him are not as visible on an official level, in the modern period, he has also come to be similarly invoked as a sign of secular reform. Ibn Rushd is held in high esteem today as a legal scholar of the Maliki school of Islamic law. However, certain strains of Islam rejected his ideas. Ibn Rushd opposed the Ash'ari theology championed by al-Ghazali by arguing that humans do have a degree of agency and that rational deduction should be part of all inquiry, including religious inquiry. He promoted a reconciliation of Islamic theology with Aristotelian philosophy, arguing that religion and philosophy are not at odds at all, but are different ways of arriving at the truth. The supporters of al-Ghazali and other Muslim thinkers of Ibn Rushd today, as well as some Islamists of today, rejected Ibn Rushd's work because of his position in support of faith and reason. So for centuries, he was largely marginalized in the Muslim theological and philosophical tradition. But starting in the mid-19th century, he has been taken up again by intellectuals at the Nakba, or Arab cultural revival. Thinkers such as Farah Hamdouni or Muhammad Rashid Rida considered how to reconcile understandings of modernity that are linked to Europe and authenticity linked to Arab and Islamic institutions and practices. They turned to Ibn Rushd as a model who had successfully negotiated different cultural traditions through rationalism. In this way, Ibn Rushd emerged as an icon of sought-after secularism. And the use of Ibn Rushd has continued to this day among progressive Islamist thinkers. It has been used to this day to promote a progressive Islam that is seen as compatible with secularism. So in the 20th and 21st centuries, Arab Maghrebian literary works on Ibn Rushd are connected to this phenomenon of claiming him as a symbol of secular Islam. So he is invoked as a model of bridge building between the Muslim world and other cultures. As a bridge figure, Ibn Rushd is a cultural translator. In contrast, in Borges' version of Ibn Rushd, he is the paragon of untranslatability. In Emily Adler's The Translation Zone, Adler suggests that there is nothing fully translatable or fully untranslatable, but rather there are challenges to the definitions of language and the human subject. In the context of enduring discourses of a clash of civilizations, and specifically religion understood as culture, there is a danger of accepting culture clash as inevitable because of the assumption of incommensurability, incongruity, and untranslatability. For this reason, I'd like to assert that what matters most is not determining whether or not ideas are, in the abstract, translatable, but how and why translatability is deemed to be hampered or enabled. What are the assumptions and attitudes that underpin understandings of linguistic and cultural translatability? As I shall explain here, although La Busca de Averroes faces head-on the constructiveness of the Orient and presents a meditation on the possibility of representing a historical figure from the medieval Islamic world, problematic essentialisms remain in the text. Borges' story ambiguously positions Averroes as both commentator and translator of Aristotle, although recall that he actually was only a commentator. The positioning of Averroes as Aristotle's translator and not just interpreter in a broad sense allows Borges to present the issues of cultural contact through the concrete example of a troubled linguistic translation, and allows for revealing transmesis. This is a term developed by scholar Beebe, which means the representation in fiction of translators in the translation process. So, the story portrays the supposed scholar-translator as he works on a philosophical treatise and is disturbed by an unresolved question. In another work in progress, his commentaries on Aristotle. Averroes is perturbed by a philological problem in his commentary on Aristotle, the meaning of the words tragedy and comedy. He puts it, quote, "No one in the sphere of Islam could conjecture what they meant. These two arcane words pullulated throughout the text of the Poetics. It was impossible to elude them." End quote. No doubt following the lead of French Orientalist Ernest Renan, whose study of Averroes Borges quotes in his epigraph to the story. Borges bases his story on the now debunked idea that medieval Arab culture had no live, non-religious theater. Moreover, he foregrounds the sphere of Islam, portrayed as an impermeable and isolated civilization, not taking into account the reality of Muslim society's contact with various cultural traditions, especially in medieval Iberia. Within this closed sphere, Averroes spends the time of the afternoon siesta writing. He has taken upon himself the project of interpreting Aristotle, and this role arises in the narrator of both admiration and pity. The narrator describes Averroes' work in the following way, quote, few things more beautiful and more pathetic are recorded in history than this Arab physician's dedication to the thoughts of a man separated from him by 14 centuries. To the intrinsic difficulties, we should add that Averroes, ignorant of Syriac and of Greek, was working with a translation of a translation, end quote. This one sentence conveys, on one hand, the narrator's attitude of superiority towards Averroes, whom he considers equally admirable and pitiable, and on the other hand, hints at the links between the medieval writer and the narrating writer who centuries later, and through other linguistic filters, attempts to represent his predecessor. Dramatic irony intensifies the pathos surrounding Averroes, as well as the tone of superiority. Twice he is offered the key to understanding Aristotle's puzzling terms, but he is unable to take hold of it. First, as he looks out from his enclosed balcony, he sees 3 children playing in the street. They are acting out the roles of a muezzin, a minaret, and a congregation. But Averroes does not take note of this small-scale theatrical production before him. Later, he goes to dinner at the house of a Quranic scholar and is part of a conversation in which a traveler who has returned from China recounts having seen a play in a theater there. At first, the Quranic scholar thinks that these people that the traveler, the recently returned traveler, is describing, who are the actors, he thinks that they must be insane. And the traveler attempts to explain to no avail that these people were actually telling a story through actions and words. The scholar derides this idea, and the others participating in the conversation, including Ibn Rushd, agree with him. Here, Averroes doesn't even suspect that what this traveler saw is the key to those enigmatic terms, tragedy and comedy. The topic of conversation between the Quranic scholar, the traveler, and Averroes immediately shifts to high praise for the Arabic language and differing opinions about Arabic poetry. Only at this point does Averroes take an active interest in the discussion. He defends traditional Arabic poetry against innovation by insisting upon the universalism of classical texts. The others listen with pleasure to this vindication of tradition, ironically placing too much faith in the core text of his religious and cultural tradition, as well as in the notion of universalism. Later that night, Averroes ironically thinks that he has arrived at the meaning of those 2 troubling words. Quote, with firm and careful calligraphy, he added these lines to the manuscript. Aristotle gives the name of tragedy to panegyrics, and that of comedy to satires and anathemas. Admirable tragedies and comedies abound in the pages of the Quran and in the mu'allaqah of the sanctuary. In the next paragraph, the narrator, speaking from the first person for the first time, and thus inserting himself in the narrative, describes Averroes looking into a mirror before going to bed. Quote, I do not know what his eyes saw, because no historian has ever described the forms of his face. The narrator immediately continues with something about which he is certain. I do know that he disappeared suddenly. So here, the story starts to point to the mediated nature of the narrator's knowledge about Averroes. And in the story, Averroes and all those things around him abruptly disappear. And it's not until the next paragraph that the reader understands why. The final paragraph, separated by a few spaces from the rest of the story so that it functions as a sort of an epilogue, is where the narrator explains how he decided to write about Averroes and what his objective was in doing so. Quote, in the foregoing story, I tried to narrate the process of a defeat. End quote. The narrator recounts how various historical figures that experienced failure came to his mind, and how he decided that the case of someone who chose to take on a challenge that was impossible for him, but would not have been for others, was more poetic. It was then that he remembered Averroes, who, closed within the orb of Islam, could never know the meaning of the tragedy and comedy. Then the narrator, with great situational irony, goes on to reflect on the process of narrating this story about Averroes. So just to pick out a few of the key phrases, you have the entire quote here. He says, I felt that the work was mocking me. I felt that Averroes, wanting to imagine what a drama is without ever having suspected what a theater is, was no more absurd than I, wanting to imagine Averroes with no other sources than a few fragments from Renan, Lane, and Asin Palacios. He was the symbol of the man I was as I wrote it, and that in order to compose that narration, I had to be that man. In order to be that man, I had to compose that narration. So we entered this cycle, or a hall of mirrors effect. The moment I cease to believe in him, Averroes disappears. In one sense, we have here a poignant realization that one can never fully know the other. And that in trying to do so, one is likely to produce a testament to who one is at that moment. Long before Said's critique of Orientalism, Borges points out that often when the other is represented, what is really represented is the self. The narrator no longer believes in his ability to know and therefore represent the other. However, his evaluation of what limits Averroes' insight remains unchanged, as demonstrated by the recurrence in the first-person epilogue of the phrase encerrado en el ámbito del Islam, or enclosed or locked within the sphere of Islam. In addition, Borges' response to his realization to stop writing about Ibn Rushd establishes attempts at knowing the other as not only as complex and slippery, but also as futile. By pointing to the textual mediation that is the author's only channel of access to Averroes, the story rejects the Enlightenment paradigm centering on seeing and knowledge that rests on the assumption that knowing is a transparent, unmediated process. However, it is a limited rejection. First, comprehension through vision is still crucial. The inability to see Averroes' face through reliance on the existing archive causes the tale to come to a halt. Second, the Borges figure who speaks in the final paragraph maintains his position as a knowing subject, because he is aware of this mediation and does not duplicate Averroes' error. Even with the limited rejection of a traditional, rational, empirical epistemology, the story offers no alternative way of knowing. Borges' Averroes simply ceases to exist. In La Busca de Averroes, cross-cultural representation, rather than stereotypical or objective, is simply impossible, and any attempt at it only mocks the author. In this way, meaning about the other emerges as not only infinitely contingent and subjective, but simply unachievable. The narrator's acknowledgement of the unknowability of self and other posits an infinitely other, different cultures that are mutually unintelligible. The two poles create a hall of mirrors that reflect each other to infinity. Such a conceptualization makes any cultural translation impossible. Although it is one thing to say that our knowledge of ourselves and of others is built on mistranslated images and translations of translations and is circumscribed by our cultural environments, it's quite another to say that there's absolutely no way to craft tentative translations and decentered representations. Many scholarly works have examined this story by Borges, with most of them arriving at a version of one of the following conclusions: that language and cultural are untranslatable, or that mistranslation is a source of innovation that springs from Borges' cultural location in Argentina, a site of settler colonialism positioned at the periphery of Europe. However, none of these critical assessments notes the underlying Orientalist bias in the story. In a nutshell, the Borges figure in the story becomes enlightened regarding his limitations, but Averroes never does. The narrator and the Borges figure who outside of the limits of the knowable. Excuse me, I'm going to skip a page. The narrator and the Borges figure who speaks in the epilogue to pick apart the process of the construction of knowledge about the other, but ironically they remain within the unquestioned position of Western knowing subject. While the Averroes that they realize is only a fiction disappears before any moment of insight. In the Borges story, Averroes, though acknowledged to be fictional, remains pathetic, and his illumination cannot even be imagined. He remains culturally constrained because the authorial voice, by knowing more than Averroes, attains knowledge and thus power. Another question remains: why at that moment and within that defeated attitude towards cross-cultural communication did Borges choose to present his ideas via a figure from the Arab Islamic world? Given the way the Orient functions in many of his other works, I interpret the recourse to Averroes as a utilization and reinscription of the Orient, as the locus of ultimate difference. In La Busca de Averroes, the Orient is not only merely beyond the rational and the real, but it is actually outside the limits of the knowable, of that which can be known empirically and rationally. Thus, as occurs in other Orient-themed texts by Borges, the Orient functions as a figure for absolute difference, even within the setting of Al-Andalus, famed for its east-west cultural contact or convivencia. The impermeability or untranslatability of Muslim cultures prevails. To whatever extent Borges' reflection on Ibn Rushd undoes conventional conceptions of the formation of identity and knowledge of the Orient, ultimately it also recreates some fixed ideas about the Orient and otherness. Borges took Ibn Rushd as an example of a person tragically limited by his religious worldview and as a site for the realization that we are all circumscribed by our cultural sphere and our pursuit of self-definition. Thus, La Busca leaves the reader with a conception of the Muslim world as nearly hermetically closed sphere, and without any hope of being able to connect with the other. The story closes any possibility of making meaning across the specific languages and cultures of East and West. It posits a void in the realm of signification Moreover, it places the Euro-Argentine writer, the Borges who speaks in the epilogue, in the position of the knowing subject. He becomes aware of the limits to his knowledge and cuts off his story, but retains the position of mastery, and that he knows more than Averroes. The perceived radical otherness of the East leads to radical untranslatability. In Borges' story, the champion of reason is not able to harness reason, but lies just outside of it. The ultimate irony of La Busca de Averroes is that while the author figure in the story is aware of the mediation of language and cultural difference, he is unaware or uncritical of the assumptions and the narratives of identity that it thrives on and supports. So now I'm going to move to one of the interlocutors with Borges. In his 2007 story, Du Balcon d'Averroes, concerning Averroes' balcony, the well-known Moroccan writer and literary critic Abdel Fattah Khalil engages in a subtle yet clear literary dialogue with Borges' La Busca de Averroes. This short story brings fragmented, self-conscious narrative to post-colonial language and identity politics and the construction of meaning together with the balcony that Borges imagined for Averroes. To begin with, the title of Quilito's story is a direct reference to the scene in Borges' story in which Averroes goes out on his balcony overlooking the street, a scene that Quilito references in the body of his story. Additionally, the crafting of the narrator in Quilito's story is very Borgesian. The narrator is an unnamed I that speaks with the persona of Quilito and muses about an epistemological conundrum. In the case of Quilito's text, the conundrum centers on a semantically rich yet oxymoronic phrase about language that Quilito, the narrator, heard in a dream. And in his dream, this phrase is uttered by none other than Averroes. Through various digressions and references to the retelling of dreams and the tedious story genre, so in the story itself, he refers to this genre of retelling a dream as something tedious and his way of drawing out the moment where he will disclose what this troublesome phrase is. Given that the phrase challenges concepts of ownership and belonging as related to language, and that the other person who appears in the dream is Quilito's translator into Arabic, who engages in various forms of language-based identity politics, I propose that the story uses Averroes as a representative of classical-era philosophy and the Andalus to mediate on the absurdities of language and identity politics, specifically in modern-day North Africa. Quilito's Bourbon d'Averroes identifies the role of translation in post-colonial contexts. In the process, it demonstrates both the limits of reason and the need to continue pursuing it in tandem with other forms of knowing. From the outset of the story, the narrator indicates that he is puzzling over this phrase heard in the dream, but he delays revealing it until the fourth page of the story. We don't know what the phrase is. And here is the famous phrase. Logatana al-Ajamiyya is presented in transliterated Arabic, along with an approximated French translation. Although both of these translations lose the connotations of the Arabic Ajami, which, as the narrator explained within the story, is an archaic term that means a stranger or one who does not speak Arabic. In the dream, the narrator is looking out of a window onto a courtyard. Barely visible in the window to his right, he senses the presence of Averroes. And in the window on his left, leaning on the ledge, he sees his translator, whom he refers to only by his initials, AK. And the narrator refers to him tongue-in-cheek as the person who claims to translate his French language works into Arabic. Much of the story consists of the narrator thinking through various possible interpretations of this phrase. How can a language be both foreign and part of one's own culture? And wondering about its historical authenticity. That is, did Averroes actually ever produce this phrase? In the process of considering these issues, the narrator presents various moments in Arab history in which the phrase could have been interpreted in a certain way, or a particular scholar could have written it. This process serves to highlight that the threat of other languages encroaching on Arabic has been felt since long before French colonization of North Africa, and that the judgment of others based on whether they use Arabic versus French is small-minded. The translator figure, AK, is a key component in Quilito's story because he embodies the type of linguistic pettiness and cultural chauvinism that the narrator critiques. With a playful, irreverent tone, the narrator describes his distaste for the translator, which stems from AK's attitude towards language and towards Quilito as a Moroccan who teaches French and writes some of his works in French. The translator insists on only speaking to the narrator in Arabic, never in French, and thinks that Quilito looks down on Arabic. The narrator links these attitudes to Arabocentrism, when he taunts the narrator for supporting the ludicrous ideas that Adam, the first human, spoke Arabic, and that the Arabs invented poetry. In short, this translator, AK, stands for the most restrictive and even destructive aspects of identity politics, and specifically of post-colonial identity and language politics. In Morocco, the period of national redefinition that followed independence from France was marked by an effort to establish a language-based nationalism built around Arabic and emphasizing Arab identity. Du Bacon d'Averroes addresses the rationale and sentiments associated with the Arabization project, using the space of the balcony to stage an ideological encounter. In the narrator's dream, he is at a window. That is a threshold of contact and potential change between his conspicuously positioned outspoken translator on one side and a shadowy Averroes on the other. In Quilito's story, more than a portrayal of Averroes, we have an invocation of it. Quilito's story uses this ambiguous Averroes to critique the consecration of figures in Arab tradition and the narrative crafting of Al-Andalus. About his brazenness in attributing a phrase to one of the venerable ancients, and says that readers must think that in his crafting of fiction, he presents the supposedly Averroan phrase as arising in a dream to diminish their anger at his insolence. In this way, Averroes is positioned as a voice of authority, but one to which Quilito cheekily attributes an absurd phrase. The narrator continues with his irreverent metafictional discussion of his inclusion of Averroes by confessing that he has not read Averroes' works, and noting that neither has his indignant reader. He says that instead of being read, Averroes is cited as an emblem and standard-bearer of Al-Andalus, as a place of tolerance and harmony. These comments on Averroes and Al-Andalus, offered in the context of a text that calls attention to the narrative process, point to the narrative construction of Al-Andalus by those who invoke it. In Quilito's story, the constructed nature of Al-Andalus, of the Al-Andalus mythology, and the characteristics with which it has been imbued are also exposed by the contrast with various historical locales, referred to through figures such as Ibn Mansur and Derrida, in which there are also a plurality of cultures and languages, but which have not been fashioned by cultural myth as spaces of openness and exchange in the way that Al-Andalus has. Through the narrator's comments on Borges' La Busca de Averroes, Quilito's story signals the complexities, akin to the oxymoronic phrase, our foreign language, that are often brushed aside in the crafting of a particular image of Al-Andalus. Quilito, the narrator, indicates that Averroes' linguistic landscape is of great interest to him. The narrator then cites the balcony scene in Borges' text, noting the similarity between the space of the window in his dream and the space of the balcony in Borges' depiction of Averroes. Without delving into the purported limits of Averroes' capacity for insight that emerge in the Borges story, this narrator refers to Averroes' contact with nascent Spanish as he watches the children playing on the street below. The children are speaking a dialect of Latin. The narrator cites Borges' text, quote, Averroes heard them dispute in the vulgar dialect, that is, in the incipient dialect of the peninsula's Muslim populace, end quote. The narrator wonders whether the street language might be that to which Averroes refers with the phrase, our foreign language. Questioning his own hypothesis, the narrator then indicates that according to Borges' story, Averroes turns away from the children to read a classical Arabic text. And in doing so, the Borgesian Averroes rejects the language of the street in favor of the written language of power. Steeped in the linguistic hierarchies of Al-Andalus, Borges' Averroes rejects linguistic plurality, and especially the plebeian Romance language that has passed from Christians to Muslims, in favor of the language that conveys Arabo-Muslim power. Quilitos subtly connects the imperial hierarchies of language present in Borges' depiction of the Andalusi scholar to his own 21st century present by turning in the next paragraph to the tense relationship between Quilito the narrator and his translator, A.K. In what the narrator refers to as a parenthetical remark, it's one of various digressions within the story, he notes that he can see A.K. on his left, quote, A.K., who speaks and teaches Arabic, how to translate his initials, while me, I am a professor of French and am supposed to write in that language, end quote. This staged digression serves to suggest the dynamics of language and power that are at play in 12th century Córdoba are akin to those that, through the translator A.K., trouble the Quilito persona who is navigating his position in post-colonial Morocco. In sum, Quilito's story presents Averroes as a venerated figure, used to construct as Andalusi, and also as a linguistic purist similar to the translator A.K., who sought the language of authority and high culture. In this way, the story does not use Averroes to give classical weight to the oxymoronic phrase, but rather to question the construction of authority and of narrative, and the politics of language and identity that strive to fix origins and the relationships between self and other through language. Another hypothesis about the meaning of the enigmatic phrase and interruptions by A.K. in which he makes fun of the narrator for his disposition, similar to the narrator in Borges' story. Quilito's narrator realizes that it is impossible to pinpoint the origin and meaning of the troubling phrase. On one hand, A.K. uses faulty reasoning to impose the exclusivity of Arabic. On the other hand, the Quilito figure, who retells the dream and comments on it, echoing the disjointed structure of the dream, is not able to use logical deduction or empiricism to identify with certainty the source and meaning of the ambiguous phrase. Instead, via the digressive and associative logic of the dream space, Quilito's narrator is able to approximate the phrase's meaning. Through this process, near the end of the text, the translator, A.K., unlike Borges' Averroes, rather than remain oblivious to the insights regarding language and identity politics, undergoes a transformation himself. Letting go of his judgments regarding language use, for the first time, A.K. speaks to the narrator in French. Emily Apter argues that in this story, Quilito, quote, gives us a parable of the untranslatable, end quote. Although untranslatability certainly is an important element in this story, I argue that a more holistic reading reveals that it uses untranslatability to point to a plethora of possible translations, and in the process to critique post-colonial identity politics. In this way, while meditating on a possibly untranslatable phrase, Quilito, in contrast with Borges' foreclosed cultural contact, actually promotes a deromanticized openness to cultural contact. Quilito's form of cultural contact is aware of socio-political hierarchies, but avoids anchoring identity in a single language. Although the phrase on which the story centers cannot be translated exactly into French or English, I contend that the story is not primarily about barriers to translation, but about how humans construct narratives that turn into formulations of identity that are based on attachment to a single language. And these identity narratives, in turn, are what give rise to a phrase such as our foreign language. Unlike in the Borges story, in Quilito's text, there is no correct translation that is being missed. Rather, the phrase requires gloss when transferred to other languages, and it actually lends itself to multiple interpretations. There is no cultural barrier to meaning, simply the need for further explanation and a phrase that is oxymoronic in any language or culture. The narrator receives the phrase, or produces it in his sleep, in a language in which he is highly proficient, his native language, although the phrase itself problematizes the concept of nativeness. Quilito presents the phrase as mysterious and having a range of possible meanings. There's no significatory void or transcendental signifier, but rather a plethora of meaning. The phrase that is initially attributed to Averroes is not comprehensible only within Muslim or Arabic or an Arabic language sphere. It is always somewhat nonsensical, just as language and identity politics are always somewhat absurd. In keeping with the focus on language and power that characterizes Quirito's œuvre, this story meditates on what makes a language ours versus foreign, or somehow both at once. Thus, it considers what makes French a permissible and even legitimate language for Quirito and his translator. Quirito, who has also written a substantial number of works in Arabic, chose to write this piece in French. By doing so, he is able to perform many of the issues at hand, and thereby foreground the power struggle between Quirito the narrator and his Arabic translator. Thus, the story brings language politics into Borges' story and brings those lessons to bear on the modern mother by calling for more fluid concepts of identity. Cultural translation, like reason, have epistemological limits that are intertwined with power. Yet that doesn't mean that reasoning or translation should be eschewed, but rather that they should be carried out with careful awareness. The last version, or the last part of this broader dialogue that I'll share with you today is the version of Ibn Rushd created by prominent Iraqi exile writer Jawad Yassin Hussein. In this version, the terms and outcome of Borges' search are inverted, and Ibn Rushd carries out a successful search for Borges. In the story, Yom Buenos Aires, the Buenos Aires Day, Hussein, who has lived in exile in France since 1976, takes the 12th century scholar directly to Borges. Hussein uses an intertextual rewriting to respond to the issues raised by Borges' representation of Ibn Rushd. Hussein creates an Ibn Rushd who champions both rationality and irrationality over religious dogma, makes contact with Borges in spite of the vast geographic and temporal distances between them, and plays with imaginative and irrational forms of knowledge as a complement to rationalism and as an incitement to try to know more. There are various differences in setting and action, to the degree that there's actually action in the Hussein story, between Borges' story and that of Hussein. The main differences are that Hussein's Ibn Rushd does not take his afternoon nap. Oh, sorry. My emphasis is wrong. Okay, so in Borges' story, he doesn't take a nap. Instead, he keeps working on this project. In Hussein's story, we enter the dream space again, similar to what happened in Quirito. So, in Hussein's story, Ibn Rushd does take his afternoon nap, and afterwards joins the traveler, recently returned from China, the same traveler that appears in the Borges story, and the Quranic scholar. So those two figures also appear again in the story by Hussein. And in this case, though, rather than Ibn Rushd going to visit them elsewhere, the two visitors come to his home. So when they arrive, he's just awoken from this dream. There is a pre-existing conflict between the two guests, the first of whom represents open-mindedness, that being the traveler, and the second, the Quranic scholar, who represents religious dogmatism. Recall that in Borges' version of the encounter, Ibn Rushd becomes a spokesman for maintaining cultural and religious tradition. In contrast, in Hussein's story, Ibn Rushd's role is to be a voice for rationalism and become an ally of the traveler. In this version of Ibn Rushd, the Borderland senses that the conversation between the two visitors may quickly become tense and wants to cite from one of his works about syllogistic reasoning. However, realizing that the conflict has not yet actually erupted, instead of turning to rationalism, he turns to irrationality and changes the subject by recounting the dream that he had while napping. Annoyed by the Quranic scholar's response to the dream, Ibn Rushd stops describing it. But after the two guests have left, the story closes with Ibn Rushd wishing he could recount his dream to the traveler and deciding that the very next day he will ask him about a fruit that he was offered by Borges in the dream. The most telling relationship in Hussein's text, however, is that between Ibn Rushd and Borges. But to discuss this, we must turn from the physical to the mental action of the narrative. The plot points that I have outlined are actually secondary to the action that takes place within Ibn Rushd's mind. This primarily consists of the dream itself and Ibn Rushd's recurring memory of a woman that he once saw in Marrakesh. The story opens and closes with his memory of a face that he often enjoys recalling. That of a woman he saw years ago when he was on his way to see the Sultan in Marrakesh. As the unveiled woman walked across the alleyway, Ibn Rushd stopped to watch her pass. The narrator notes, quote, "The image of her face remained embedded in his memory to this very day." And then the narrator asks, what radiant face did he see? In other words, what was that face like? What were her features? Here, Hussein's narrator responds, quote, "He never told us, nor did Abdul Wahid al-Marrakeshi, who wrote a lot of stories about Ibn Rushd. Neither told us about the image of that face." This passage clearly echoes the moment in La Busca de Averroes in which the Borgesian narrator states that he does not know what Averroes saw when he stood in front of the mirror. In the case of Borges' story, the lack of information about the face, that is, the identity of the subject of the story, leads to the abrupt end of the story and the bankruptcy of attempts at representing or finding Averroes. In contrast, in Hussein's text, the features of the woman's face are unknown to the we that includes the otherwise uninvolved narrator and the reader. But this does not impede the main character's relationship to the Marrakeshi woman. In fact, quote, "The features of the woman's face had been imprinted in his mind for years," end quote. So much so that when she comes to mind at the end of the story, he is perfectly willing to brush her memory and her image aside in order to think about a new object of desire, the exotic red fruit that Borges offers him when he visits him in Buenos Aires. With regard to the dream, the way it begins is very suggestive. While lying in bed contemplating the mental image of the Marrakeshi woman, with heavy eyelids, Ibn Rushd hears seagulls, then sees multicolored ocean birds that are unfamiliar to him, and after this, he falls asleep. The sequencing of sounds, new sights, and then sleep strongly suggests that a dream is actually a vision, because he starts to see new things before he's actually fallen asleep. However, throughout the story, the narrator and main character refer to the experience as a dream. This passage hints to the reader that perhaps it was something else that occurred, not only a dream, and produces uncertainty regarding the border between wakefulness and sleep, reality and dream. Thus, from its very start, the dream implies that not only is the space between cultures traversable, but the space between sleep and wakefulness, dream and reality, and imagination and reason is also porous. Imagined sensorial experiences intermingle with reason. After waking and joining his guests, Ibn Rushd recalls the entire dream or vision, bit by bit. But he does not recount it in its entirety. Instead, much of the narrative consists of his thought process as he recalls the dream and past events and considers saying these thoughts out loud. So he's trying to decide how receptive his audience will be, and should he mention this or not. In the dream, he travels to a new land without getting dusty from the journey. And there, in a city called Buenos Aires, a blind man named Borges welcomes him into his home. Unlike the Averroes imagined in La Busca de Averroes and cited by Quilito, this Borges does not reject the incipient this Averroes does not reject the incipient Spanish of Al-Andalus and has a conversation with Borges in Spanish, or more specifically it says Bilahja Kashgaliya. Borges talks with him about the classical tradition, quotes Averroes' texts, and asks him about the cause of Averroes' exile. He also offers him a type of fruit he had never seen before, tomatoes. Ibn Rushd smells the strange scent of the fruit, but at that moment he is drawn away from it by Borges' question about his misfortune. his loss of the caliph's favor, and exile from Cordoba. The element that ties together Ibn Rushd's gathering with the traveler and the Quranic scholar, the memory of the Marrakeshi woman, and the Buenos Aires dream, is the leitmotif of the face. Although in La Busca, the face represents a lack, an absence of markers of identity that is the catalyst for the end of the representation of Ibn Rushd. Here, as witnessed by the visage of the Marrakeshi woman, faces are accessible and enduring in spite of the vagaries of time. Yet at the same time, they are not accessible to all. The narrator and reader have no access to the details of this space, and the narrator simply accepts this lack of information. Hussein's Ibn Rushd is not characterized by ignorance and enclosure in a faith-based cultural realm, vis-a-vis a knowing narrator. Instead, he has access to knowledge that the narrator and the reader do not have. Additionally, in Hussein's story, faces are mutable. The characters' faces fluctuate in appearance at different points of the story. The text describes the face of Borges' character, but in a melding of different personalities and then disparate times, places, and realities, Borges' face and that of the two guests in Cordoba come to resemble each other. In this way, in Hussein's reworking of La Busca de Averroes, faces and the identities that they represent are partially accessible and open to transformation. That is, partial knowledge and fluid identities are part of reality, such as it is in this story. Borges tried unsuccessfully to access Ibn Rushd through the logic of writing, whereas Hussein's Ibn Rushd was successful in making contact with Borges through the conjoining of reason and sensory experience that exceeds the limits of reason. Hussein's story features a fusion of the oral and the written that reflects a merging of the episteme of logic and that of sensory experience. One example of the melding of orality and literacy is the culmination of Ibn Rushd's conversation with Borges, in which Borges, immediately after offering him this red fruit that the Cordoban had never seen before, asks Ibn Rushd about the cause of his exile. Ibn Rushd responds by recounting a dangerous miscommunication that occurred due to the transference of a scribe's stutter to the written page. So it's an unusual example because there's this idea that because the scribe stuttered, somehow a mistake was entered into the text. So there's this lack of a barrier between orality and literacy. There's a strange melding of the two. This fantastic merging of orality and literacy highlights the mediation of experience through signs, while maintaining a desire to attempt to construct meaning. Ibn Rushd's recounting of the unfortunate episode described is yet another instance of storytelling, and stories within stories, or metafiction, within young Buenos Aires. In this story about storytelling, the senses steer much of the narration, in that they are what fueled Ibn Rushd's interest in learning about the unknown fruit. In Hussein's story, Ibn Rushd takes on a role similar to that of the narrator in Borges' story, in that Ibn Rushd has an illusory experience, in Hussein's text, this dream. However, in Hussein's text, Ibn Rushd not only decides to continue exploring the alternate reality of his dream, but he's driven to learn about and comprehend his new object of desire, the tomato, because of its aroma and his curiosity about its taste. And I forgot to. Where reason would lead to a significatory aporia, openness to the sensorial knowledge offered by the dream promised to satisfy his desire for knowledge. Time travel permitting, in and of itself, the not improbable idea that Borges and Ibn Rushd could dialogue through a common Proto-Spanish is in stark contrast to the barriers to contact that Borges posits. In contrast with La Busca, which ends with a hall of mirrors that reflect unknowability and defeat into infinity, Young Buenos Aires is built on the idea of the possibility of cultural translatability, and ends with the enticing possibility of knowing, even outside of the rationality of space and time, even if only partially and subject to transformation. Overall, Hussein's story points to the space in between dream and reality, past and present, fiction and truth, what is thought and what is uttered, what is seen and smelled but not tasted, to tell us that the borders between the two can be porous and permeable. Often we cannot grasp with certainty in concrete reality, but we can know the pursuit of reality, the desire to know, the desire to taste the tomato. While Borges writes from a periphery, albeit one strongly identified with Europe, this leads to the opportunity to playfully contest the center, and also the possibility of echoing the controlling discourses of the center. The choices that Hussein makes in rewriting Borges' Averroes have the effect of stripping off the Orientalist filters still present in Borges' story, and thereby removing Ibn Rushd from the sphere of radical alterity and consummate unknown. This allows Hussein to use Ibn Rushd to open up the conception of representation as a closed, barren circuit, and offer the desire to know more, the desire to taste new fruit, via multiple forms of knowledge. Hussein responds to Borges' ambiguously Orientalist depiction of Ibn Rushd with a fantastic story in which Ibn Rushd travels through time and space to meet Borges in Buenos Aires. By focusing on Ibn Rushd's imagined sensorial experience and desires, rather than only the life of a closed mind, Hussein's story responds to Borges' portrayal of Ibn Rushd as a symbol of cultural separation and inability to create meaning, with an Ibn Rushd that symbolizes cultural connection and the endless possibilities of signification. Quilito and Hussein, in works that directly address that of Borges, take up issues of post-colonial identity and assert the possibility of intercultural dialogue through other forms of signification and identity construction. Hussein, in particular, creates an Ibn Rushd who is able to make contact with Borges in spite of the vast geographic and temporal distances between them. Hussein's Ibn Rushd not only champions rationality over dogmatism, but carries out a fantastic journey to meet Borges in Buenos Aires, and thus demonstrates how creativity and inquisitiveness can build cultural bridges. Significantly, both of these stories that respond to Borges' text center on dreams, the space of the irrational par excellence, and the effort to convey them to others beyond the dream state. Thus, in terms of the specific details that I've mentioned, as well as their overall narrative thrust, these works interweave different epistemologies, different ways of knowing. They counter the entrenched belief that there is only one valid system of knowledge, that which is based on the rationalism of science and technology. At the same time, these works do not fall into a rejection of rationalism, which itself leads to a host of other problems. Various scholars have pointed to the pitfalls of this trend towards anti-Enlightenment theories that promote non-rationalism and non-universalism. Post-structuralism, by emphasizing the mediation of language and anti-essentialism and certain strands of post-colonial theory, rely on an assumption that transcultural communication is impossible because meaning is ultimately inaccessible. The result of this has been that the non-Western other remains inaccessible and unknowable. Instead, in the text by Hussein and Quilito, Euro-American reason is no longer the privileged producer of knowledge, but is interwoven with non-rational ways of knowing. Thus, Hussein and Quilito respond to Borges by establishing epistemological plurality and the possibility of knowing beyond cultural boundaries. The disjuncture between Borges and his Arab interlocutors, that is, the radically different assessments and responses regarding the same scholar, in and of itself could support Borges' stance in La Busca regarding intercultural communication. However, hope springs eternal. After the moment of critical insight into Orientalism and despondent concession of defeat in the face of cross-cultural representation in La Busca de Averroes, Borges went on to represent the other many times. Although Ian Almond positions La Busca de Averroes as a point of culmination with regard to the treatment of Islam in Borges' ode, this body of work does not form a linear evolution. Rather, the many versions of Borges and Borgesian writing that follow the story of Averroes spiral out to display a multitude of attitudes towards the Arab and Muslim world. I seek to highlight the fact that Borges did not recover from the despondence regarding representation that the figure of Averroes inspired him. Even if he did fall into the same representational traps again, he endeavored to make more direct contact. In fact, his desire to better understand the culture that had so often sparked his creativity led him to spend his last days studying Arabic. In 1986, Borges, at the age of 87, already blind for a few decades and dying of lung cancer in Switzerland, chose to spend the last weeks of his life taking Arabic lessons. And when his Egyptian tutor arrived, the tutor recognized him immediately and started to weep when he saw who the student was going to be. So with his physical condition making the odds of him attaining any proficiency extremely low, it must have been the playful dynamism that Borges found in the act of translation and in writing in general that motivated him to try to connect across cultural and linguistic differences. Distances as far as those traveled by Ibn Rushd himself in Hussein's text. Clearly, for the tutor, who recognized Borges immediately, translation had been successful in creating some form of connection. Certainly without translation, Filippo and Hussein would not have had access to the Borges story to which they respond. Indeed, the textual dialogue that these translations facilitated and inspired supports the possibility of meaningful intercultural contact. Although Borges' text reveals the underlying assumptions that create notions of untranslatability, together with those by Filippo and Hussein, it offers hope that attention to how knowledge is created and transferred can lead to fruitful dialogue. And I'd like to try and wrap up by referring to the idea of tolerance. It's something that I spend the conclusion of the book looking at. And one of the main critiques of tolerance is that it's often presented in a sort of hierarchical fashion where we sort of offer tolerance to a group that somehow annoys us because they're not up to par. And so, for this reason, tolerance has been critiqued by some as a sort of shallow idea. But what I try and point to is that if we are aware of the ideologies that form, that underlie our narratives about ourselves and our communities, we can be aware of how other identities are also formed by narrative. And this can lead to a more equitable and more profound tolerance. So this type of exchange through translation can move things in that direction. Thank you.
It was just a great pleasure. I was just curious, well, first of all, I just want to relate a little anecdote, which the Brazilians here probably know, but recently it's come to light that the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro II, who had listened to lectures about the Arab world when he was emperor, after he abdicated in his final year of his life in Paris, he started to translate the Arabian Nights. So we have this emperor producing this, the first 100 pages of the translation of the Arabian Nights. So these are these kinds of moments that we kind of forget. That not only we're more aware of him listening to the lectures about Orientalism, Richard Burton in Brazil, and that. But actually, what I'm curious about in terms of your talk is, I like your nuanced discussion of untranslatability, your response to it in the actor. And maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seemed to me that you were uncomfortable at some times with post-colonial studies and almost articulating a little bit of. I'm remembering yesterday in the last panel, there was a gesture towards in the Hispanophone world, also the Lusophone world, often people are not very comfortable with the way post-colonialism has been sort of transplanted and applied, and we assume that Borges has the same location as Ever Blaine or Richard Burton, or who were representing empire. So I'm just wondering if was I reading too much into? Are you articulating a critique of?
Yeah, I mean, in the broader project of the book, I use actually a lot of the term coloniality. I just didn't want to have to do an extensive footnote on it, although I guess with the work yesterday, you already prepared the field for that. But on the one hand, one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize is the ways that the colonial relations of power still exist. So
Of course,
for that reason, the coloniality captures that more. And the whole project of the book is to look at how the colonial relations of power, although a very, not a modern empire, the Islamic empire in Andalus had certain relations of power that are used by contemporary writers today to talk about colonial relations of power that still exist. A lot of, there's a section of the book that focuses on migration. So there's a lot of the issues of north-south disparities in terms of wealth disparities, etc. So I'm trying to emphasize how there's a continuity in terms of these relations of power that these writers are creatively working with to show that they're actually, in some ways, things haven't changed since that moment. It's just that it's flipped. Who's in power has flipped. And then the other thing was, in this chapter in particular, I look at different epistemologies, and so I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't saying that we should reject rationalism, because that's somewhat absurd to me, because it's going from one extreme to another.
Ron had a question, and then we'll see.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Robert, for bringing Christina here.
Ron is my colleague who, among other things, teaches translation.
Oh.
And I'll be teaching the Averroes story, actually, the translation course next semester, so I'm very glad that I attended this lecture. I wanted to ask you about, this was a very lucid and elegant development, how you bring in Khalid and Hussein into the interpretation of the Borges story. But I wonder, considering that Borges is a translator himself, whether the way he looks at Averroes is the way he also understands his own personal limitations as a translator. So, seen in this way, and I was looking actually to see when he wrote the 1001 Nights essay, and that's from 1936. Lane, in fact, comes out as a biblical figure. So if I bring that into, if I look at the Averroes story through Borges reading Lane's translation of 1001 Nights, then I don't know if he's that. Maybe he is actually a critic of Orientalism, and not one who is. He doesn't strike me in that story as particularly Orientalist. There was the other 1001 Nights story. I couldn't find a date for that, a shorter one, where he talks about Orientalism. That is more Orientalist than the Averroes.
The Mirror of Ink, or which
Yeah,
one?
it's the essay on
very
1001
short one.
Nights.
Yeah.
The essay, okay.
I don't know when that was written, so just.
It's a very slippery story, I would say, and it's been interpreted in wildly different ways. But I would say that, for one thing, I'm curious now to go back and look at the 1001 Nights essay, because I can recall how he presented the word, and that would be interesting if he treated them in a similar way. But I guess for me, the clincher is that he ascribes Averroes' inability to understand these terms to being, quote, enclosed within the sphere of Islam. So that phrase that's repeated a few times in the story is to me what tipped the balance. Because even the concept of, saying, oh, he's a pitiable figure, well, you could say that that's, he feels some sort of empathy towards him or something. But then when it has that phrase and the the tone of the narrator in that little epilogue paragraph seems to me that it tips it in the direction of, that he saw it as an impossibility for.
Well, he's historically dead wrong too. I mean, just as Marvin's work has sort of led me to that, is that Ibn Quzman, Ibn Hazm, there's been all the studies of all kinds of performances
Yes,
going on, so
right.
he's just
But that was-
completely wrong. And
right.
it's funny because I spend all of my time with students saying there's Hispanic Orientalism, and as soon as you kind of unpack the story, I went, this is kind of Orientalism par excellence here, actually, coming from Borges, who, as Lucy and many others have pointed out, is as sophisticated sort of an interpreter of Islam from outside and Islamic culture as anyone. I went, gee, I think this is like sort of Said's definition of Orientalism here,
Yeah,
which
it's fascinating.
runs. I'm sorry, Lucy.
Yes, thank you so very much, Christina, for a lovely keynote lecture. Now, I have two questions for you. The first one is a very short one. I was wondering about Hussein's tomato. Why? Because, of course, it comes from tomato. It's Mexican. It's not Argentinian.
No,
So
it's
does that
not.
represent?
I think the
New
idea,
world?
I think the idea is that it's something from the new
From the-
world, that
from the
that
new world.
existed in Al-Andalus, let alone.
All
All right.
Hard to
Concept.
For Borges to have a little strange to see the tomato, which is so Mexican. Now another thing. Borges, of course, skepticism about translation, about language, sounds kind of post-colonial to us now, or could sound like that. But of course, he was reading Malcolm and Wittgenstein, and of course, they are very skeptical about language. What would you comment on that?
I mean, I think there's definitely, I was trying to explain sort of that the danger of being too skeptical is that then you end up with this idea of, the closed orb where you can't have contact. So we do need to be somewhat skeptical, because we need to be aware of the power that's at play in any translation, in the moment of literal, linguistic translation or cultural translation. But to be aware of also the assumptions that lead to whether we think that there can be cultural contact or not. Is what I was getting at.
But I think he was thinking about Mahler especially.
Okay.
Yes, and Wittgenstein, of course, but even Mahler especially. So he sounds very, very modern, but of course he's quoting these German philosophers. So thank you so very much.
Maybe he should have been more skeptical of Lane. That's right. Why was he not skeptical of Lane?
Thank you. I would like to follow up with Paul's question. When you do afterlife, I think we should do afterlife of postcolonialism. And to say, for instance, the case of Abdel Fattah is a lot to do with the context of authoritarianism in Morocco, which impede certain language, and all the game between Arabity, Amazighi, and French. I would say that we should read how authoritarian states manipulated this much more than we keep on this schema of no doubt that okay, it has something to do with this, but I think it is a combination of this.
Yeah, I think one of the points I try and make in the book is that, like I said earlier, that these authors are using Andalus to try to decry these moments of imposition on identities or on social well-being, essentially through authoritarian states or colonial powers. So both are being critiqued through these works, for sure.
Again, please, please avail yourself of, coffee, tea, juice, croissant, It's wonderful everybody wants to sort of continue the conversation. If you'd like to ask a question, can you do it over here so that we can get you on camera? That's, otherwise we'll just have a disembodied voice. There's a comment right there.
Okay, I just wanted to say a word in defense of Borges. I think that indeed, as Robert has pointed out, Borges is dead wrong as indeed Western scholarship generally has been in assuming that the Arab world doesn't know anything about performance or representation. But the reason for that, of course, is that, and I think the rhetoric of Averroes' search confuses the matter a little in that it focuses on tragedy and comedy and not on mimesis, which is a real problem. This is what is really tripping up that character created by Borges. But again, the Bacchanal or the Hakaraki or all of the various storytelling traditions, the puppet theater to which Robert referred to where I work, all of these things, of course, involve mimesis, and performative representation and so on. It's just that, like most Westerners, Borges thought that the only way you can have theater was in Western style theater. All these other things really didn't count or were not coded that way. But it seems to me that Borges, in a sense, redeems himself by the final paragraph, where he goes back and says, but after all, what do I know? I'm looking at this through the particular lens of my own culture, and my Averroes is a construct, and I think we have to take that seriously and say, yes, it is a construct, and it is a construct that imposes upon Averroes the kind of blindness that Borges, in fact, has about representation within the Arab world.
Thank you. You should.
To represent Averroes as, one that's conditioned by mediation, and that's it, is because of those certain phrases about Islam that pop up in the text. For me, what is the moment where he's sort of, proves himself again, shall we say, is by the fact that he decided to spend his last days studying Arabic. I find that to be very interesting, that he was willing to try to do this as, an exercise. Obviously, he wasn't going to attain any great proficiency, but he did obviously believe that there was some ability to cross languages and cultures.
I feel like I'm moderating now. Thanks, Christina, for that. It was great. I was thinking about a lot of different things, and just a couple things I wanted to kind of throw out. I think Borges, if we remember, Borges is our construct too, right? So the Borges we talk about it as if he were a first world giant. And I think if we go back to 1947, things aren't going so great for him in Argentina. He's adopting other girls going after him, and he's going to end up with chickens instead of the National Library. So I think it's important to bear in mind. But the thing I wanted to, there was a word that popped out of me, and it's because of the Garden of 14 Paths, another story by Borges, is accumulation. And that's such a weird verb, or noun. But it's the word that he uses in the Garden of 14 Paths to talk about all of the possible paths a life can take. If you turn one way, this is the way it happens. But there are all the others, and they're there. They didn't go away. They're still accumulating. And to me, it feels like he's trying. I don't think he succeeds in this story. You're absolutely right. But I think accumulation is actually a really interesting image for all the possible translations that are existing at the same time. You make a choice, you go down a path, but all those others are there too. And I don't know, I feel like he didn't quite get there, but there's something he's trying. I mean, I feel like that story is one of the stories where you feel like he's really working with it, like so many stories. But that's all, I just wanted to mention that.
I didn't have time to go into here, but as you mentioned, at that moment, pluralism was on the rise, and he was already starting to experience, basically, kind of being sidelined by the Zionist government. He was quote unquote demoted to poultry inspection from his job in the library of Buenos Aires. So in other words, they were telling him, get lost. So that's one of the explanations for why you could say that the tone of the story is maybe a bit more despondent than other texts. So that context.
I have one more question here from George, and then we could, have a conversation. But it'd be nice for people to stop for, we're a couple of minutes late before the next panel starts. Actually, stop, have a coffee, go outside for a minute, and then we'll start the other panel around the lunch. For George.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question really, and Christina, what a fantastic story and geographic trajectory. But I just wanted to, just as an aside, add something that struck me from that passage from Borges that you put on the screen, which is that in taking Averroes to task, he's doing it because he's unaware of the role of Syriac, which is what he says, as the medium language for the classical tradition, right? He's working with the translation of that translation, and we often think that the classical tradition was somehow, translated from the Greek into Arabic directly, but in fact it was the Syriac language, which is the mother language of Arabic, that makes its way into it. So Borges knew a lot more than we're giving him credit for, and you open up any encyclopedia of the history of philosophy today, you will see, now they have these sections, the role of Syriac in the transmission of the classical tradition. And of course, Garshuni, which is an Al-Hamiado language that writes Arabic using the Syriac script, is still spoken in many of the liturgies of the different churches of the Arab world, so it's a language that's with us today. So all of this comes together in very weird sort of ways, but he was very knowledgeable, Borges, about the actual trajectory of all of those translations.
Aristotle. I think he chose to do that as part of the story because he knows so much about the context.
It must have been an Arabic translation of the Syriac, which was a translation of the Greek, and Averroes didn't know either of those two languages.
Anyways, absolutely marvelous. Scholars in this particular area. The subject of the conference, which has gone in all kinds of directions. So I'm very grateful to all of the participants, especially to Nancy and Kassar and Amy Zinger for helping us put on this extraordinary event. Today's keynote speaker is somebody that I came into awareness about as a result of the graduate course I teach on Latin America, Al-Andalus, and the Arab world. Her book, Between Arabs and Argentines, was how I came to know about her, but it turns out, of course, not surprisingly, that she does a whole range of subjects that are also of profound interest to me and have everything to do with the conference. This is Christina Civantos. She's an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Miami. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California at Berkeley, and researches and teaches modern Hispanic and Arabic literary and cultural studies with a focus on empire and post-colonial studies, nationalisms, the Arab diaspora in the Americas, and the ethno-racial and gender politics of literacy. She's the recipient of a 2010-11 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship for her work on the intersections between novels by Elias Khoury and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is some of her most interesting work, a sort of supplement that among other things, that Elias Puri wrote to the famous Crónica de una muerte anunciada, the Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Garcia Marquez. And this is the other half of the story, which is the Lebanese relative who doesn't go to Colombia. And I knew nothing about the novel, and even people who know about it, Elias Puri, frequently didn't know about it. So she has done that work. Her publications include numerous essays in academic journals, as well as the book I just mentioned, Between Argentines and Arabs, Argentine Orientalism, Arab Immigrants, and the Writing of Identity. And her most recent book, which has everything to do with what we're doing here, which is called The Afterlife of Al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia in Contemporary Arab and Hispanic Narratives. This book examines medieval Muslim Iberia as a tool for post-colonial critique in literary and filmic narratives produced in the 20th and 21st century, Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and Argentina. Please join me in welcoming Christina Civantos, whose keynote is entitled Andalusi, Philosopher Abroad, Averroes,